Welcome back to our study in Deuteronomy, and we're in our 20th study, lesson number 19, plus the introduction lesson that we shared. And the overall theme of our Deuteronomy study, you may remember, is looking back, going forward. And as we've made our way more through Deuteronomy, there's a little less, as Moses talks about, looking back and more about going forward. What's going to happen when you land and take the promised land and settle in there, and the government you'll set up, and the lifestyle and way you'll do worship, and so many things that we'll talk about. And so as you get later, you get a lot of different topics that he brings about that are going to happen when they settle in there. And we're in that kind of section of the book now as we're starting to draw some of our study to a close. Back when I was working on my doctorate in graduate school, you're required to read some things that, frankly, you wouldn't read on your own. Books you didn't even know existed. But I remember when I was doing my doctoral studies, I was required to read this book, and I took it, read it, wrote a book review on it, stayed on my shelf, and it's kind of remained an impression on me, probably because of the title, and maybe because it has this purple look to it. It's called Slavery, Sabbath, War, and Women. Said it sounds like a Civil War novel, a little edgy maybe or something, but actually it's by a Midianite seminary professor named Willard Swartley, and I read this back in the early 90s, and it was about biblical treatment of these four topics. And so I was kind of reminded of that when I thought about where we're going now in Deuteronomy 21, the latter part of that chapter, and on through chapter 22, just some topics that Moses is bringing up for them to share. So on your outline that you can get from the website, the church website, or the church office, I would say at the very beginning of it, we could call this study Children, Neighbors, Clothing, and Marriage, because these are four subjects here in these chapters that Moses talks about for when they settle into the promised land. So let's walk through them, and let's see what Moses gives some instructions to these people. First is about rebellious children, as I told the group I was teaching live, something we know nothing about. Firsthand. But this idea, what happens when children aren't going to be respectful and contributing to the welfare of the family and of society. So Moses says this, we're starting there at verse 18. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother, and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town will stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear it and be afraid. This is kind of like the prodigal son before the prodigal son in the Gospels, except the prodigal son in the parable goes rebelliously off to a foreign country, and this one stays home. And in spite of his parents' efforts, right, to discipline, to structure, he's not contributing. In fact, I say this of him, he is a consumer, not a contributor. It's what I can get without helping out in any way and responsibly. Apparently a child that would be considered adult in that culture. And let's remember that adulthood came on quite a bit younger than it does in our society. So you're looking at somebody, maybe a child in their late teens that is only concerned with themselves, not concerned with taking some responsibility and such. And that is part of what God would want for the community, that you're not just concerned about yourself and getting what you want. You're willing to contribute to the society around you. You see the quote there I put from Thessalonica, from 2 Thessalonica chapter 3, reminding you of Paul's instructions to those who are kind of freeloaders in that community. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: if a man will not work, he shall not eat. We hear that there are some among you who are idle. They are not busy, they are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the bread that they keep, to pull your weight, if you will, to be a contributor to the community of faith, to God's family there, and to, frankly, their own families. And I suppose there has always been this idea of a generation, my parents, maybe my grandparents, when I was young, probably thought I wasn't pulling my weight, being as responsible as I could. We grew up, we take that. But here's sometimes, and it can be a problem of young people who don't grow up and they kind of stay in that consumer receiver idea instead of a contributor to things. I put a quote there. You can see it comes from Socrates, 470 BC, so 2,500 years ago, just to say this is not a new dynamic that's taken place. Children, they have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders, love for chatter in place of exercise. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, tyrannize their teachers. Children are now tyrants. And I guess every generation, it could have been said yesterday. It could have been said 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50, 100 years ago. It was always kind of had that dynamic. So it's not a new thing, is it, that folks would deal with. Now, we'll recognize here that the punishment that is given out here is all the men of the town will stone him to death. Sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? A friend of mine said when he was young, his mother rocked him and she used really big rocks. But here we talked last week about lex talionis, about the punishment being equal to the crime. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth is an example of lex talionis. And I have to confess that when you see this, not to condone being rebellious, but to be stoned to death seems kind of an extreme thing. A couple of things that possibly would come to mind. There's a phrase there that we find in this verse and in this passage and others in verse 21. You must purge the evil from among you. And I put a note there that phrase, purge the evil, is found 9 times in Deuteronomy. And there are those points when it seems a bit extreme when God tells Moses and the people, you go and when you take this Canaanite land, you destroy all the cities and all the people and all the livestock, like God wants a clean slate to work with. And a concern here that this would be something that would have a greater corruption, that would take this rebellious spirit, and rebellious spirits, complaining spirits can feed into other people's lives. They can be contagious and such. And so it says at the end, all Israel will hear it and be afraid. Now, perhaps, I don't know of a biblical example, frankly, where this was practiced. I don't know of any time it says in the Bible or a historical example where a rebellious child was taken out and stoned. So maybe like some others of the rules, you don't find that they were put into practice. Perhaps the idea is you put a bad enough punishment there it will be intimidating, and if it ever was practiced, it would be even more of an intimidating thing that would kind of deter others from practicing that kind of rebellion. So those are some things I think that are worthy of decision. I will point this because we always want to read Deuteronomy as an Old Testament book in light of New Testament theology and the teachings of Jesus particularly. And I mentioned earlier the prodigal son. And the prodigal son was rebellious and disrespectful for his father. And the ones who criticized Jesus the most were those purists, the Pharisees. Said we got to get back to obeying the law to the nth degree, to the letter of the law. And so when a rebellious child in the parable, a rebellious child is coming back, toward the home, the Pharisees start picking up rocks, if they were going to follow the law. That's a rebellious kid, says to stone him. We'll take care of that. But in the story, a loving father goes and runs to the kid and embraces him and says, get a coat on his back and get a ring on his finger. Let's put some shoes on his feet. My son was lost, but he's returned. We rejoice, have a party, and who could throw stones then? So I always see that grace. There's justice. God's a God of justice, but mercy and love overcome the demand for justice over for us. That we don't get what we deserve, but God gives us his mercy and his care in return. 2 things before we move on from this part, and that's this. First, I think it's worth noting that the treatment does not judge the parents for the actions of the adult child. There's not the parents, we didn't do something right, we didn't raise them correctly. They were trying, they were doing disciplines and giving warnings, he wasn't heeding them. And so sometimes we can be quick to judge the parents for the rebellion of their kids, and they can come to an age they're responsible for their own decisions. And I'll also note this, the parents don't implement the punishment. Takes it to the town elders. It's their kid, he's emotionally involved with it. We need somebody maybe a little more sound in their reasoning than we would be at this case. In the ancient world, times the father of the family, the patriarchal figure of the family, kind of ruled. You just did whatever the father would say to do. But here you got to get the community involved. Here you need some sound counsel from those involved. And I think that's a meaningful thing that would take place in there. It's worth noting. So we talked about rebellious children. Let's move a little bit further away from home and let's talk about neighbors. What kind of neighbors are you going to have? And one is the first part is about lost property. We shared last week about honesty and not stealing from your neighbor by moving the boundary stone that would define where your property lines were and your neighbor's property lines began. It's a way of stealing from him, ultimately stealing from God. But also wealth in the biblical world was in property and land, and it was also in livestock. And so what happens when a piece of livestock gets away? If you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to its owner. If they do not live near you, or if you do not know who owns it, take it home with you, keep it until they come looking for it, then give it back. Do the same if you find their donkey or cloak or anything else they've lost. Do not ignore it. If you see your fellow Israelites' donkey or oxen fallen on the ground, do not ignore it. Help the owner get it to its feet. And there's this sense of compassion. Now we learn as kids, I don't know if we'd say we teach it to our kids, but we learn as kids a little principle called finders keepers. You know, your cattle, your oxen, your donkey lands over here on my property. Too bad for you, good for me. I get to keep it. Nope, that's not the spirit of this text, is it? You have a responsibility, be a good neighbor, take care of it, go to some sacrifice, go to some help, be willing to assist in such so that something can go back to its rightful owners. I was remembering a gentleman in our church who passed away a couple of years ago named Taylor Kaywood. Taylor loved his cows that he raised. In a time when some storms, tornadoes actually came through our community, the cows wandered off and he had to go find them. And when he finds his cows, he finds not only his cows, but he finds some extra livestock there, a couple of extra heifers and a bull that didn't belong to him, belonged to the neighbor. And he took them in until the exchange could take place and get it in its rightful place. And I thought of that as a good implementation of this story. But it's not just something that might happen on the farm. It can be being a good neighbor to somebody who lives in the city next to you. My next door neighbor used to always call, and I knew when the phone showed his number what had happened. He called because my dog had gotten out. He said, "Your dog's out," and gave just me the heads up. I better go home before he wanders off too far. Just being a good neighbor that we ought to be. Because here's the truth. Someday you're going to need a good neighbor. Be the good neighbor, because someday you're going to need a good neighbor who will watch after you and go the extra mile and cover something for you and be careful for you. And so in the crisis times, do the right thing, because emergencies don't make people. They show what kind of people they are. That's what comes out in things. And you're not just in it for yourself, not taking advantage of a crisis situation just to add to your livestock. Too bad you shouldn't have let your cattle get away, your oxen get away. No, you're showing compassion, you're showing responsibility. You're going to need that also. Also, then we have lost property. Then it's about being safe, having safety protocols that are taken in place so folks in your home will be safe. And so it gives this thing. Remember, they've lived in tents for 40 years, wandering in the wilderness. They're going to go in and they're going to build homes eventually. So when you build a new house, make a parapet around the roof so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof. Of course, in the biblical day, the roof of a house was part of the living space, and a stairway that was made often on the outside of the house as you get there. And in the heat of the summer, that might be a place where it was cooler. You might sleep up there, entertain guests up there. It's part of the living space. That would be. So it says build a parapet, build a wall so someone won't accidentally step off. It's kind of like the first building code, isn't it? Just for safety's sake. Don't just warn them. Watch out for the edge. Put some kind of a barrier there for their protection. So your house would be a place of safety. We all like our homes to be places we feel like we're going to be safe. Boy, did you hear the one about the man who read that most accidents happen within a mile of your home? So he moved. Well, that doesn't help. So we have those things. And we have, building regulations, building codes today that can be aggravating at times, but primarily they're for our safety. And so that our homes will be safe for ourselves and for any guests that might come around. So there's to take care of that. We keep insurance, don't we, just in case accidents do happen. But the idea there, not just for ourselves, but for others, that they wouldn't meet danger or harms, find themselves in harm's way or get hurt on our property of such. So there's their neighbors, about being a good neighbor inside your home and for what wanders onto your property. Third topic we're going to look at in these chapters, we get to chapter 22 here at verse 5, is clothing. This is an often quoted verse. You may have heard it pulled out from Deuteronomy. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear woman's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. This is an interesting topic to talk about. Now, it's not as scandalous today as it's something might have seemed some days before. If you're old enough, you may remember the scandalous of when a lady might wear slacks to church. And in my Bible study, I said, well, the ladies here are all wearing slacks when we were teaching this at the church, and they pointed lady slacks. And that's right, because God made in his image, male and female, it says in Genesis. And as he made us male and female, our physiologies are different. Thus, our clothing is different. Many times in this study, we've said God's giving these instructions so his people would be distinguished from the culture and the pagan religions and their followers around them. And so I suspect here there was some kind of universal clothing that was used. But here you say, this is a tribute to the creator God who created male and female. And so their clothes are designed to reflect that. Every culture ultimately determines about what is fashionable and what is fitting and is to be shared. Some might say we are under the new covenant, and so like some of the dietary laws, this doesn't apply as much as would take place. But I don't think, and I believe most would agree, that this isn't a violation if ladies wear slacks or more if men wear kilts. In fact, there's more of the clothing than just this one here in this passage, because you go down some verses and it says, do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together, and make tassels on the four corners of the cloak you wear. So if somebody is saying, like ladies shouldn't wear slacks, and say, well, are you wearing tassels on the corners of your clothing? Because the Bible says that too. And don't look at my shirt. I'm afraid that somewhere it might say that there's a blended fabric that is made of it. And so the big key, I think, as far as our appearances and our clothing that is part of that, is modesty. So it says in 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 10, therefore I want men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger, disputing. I want women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or pearls or gold or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. And I think that are principles that apply no matter what gender that we're talking about, that we'd share, that there would be modesty that would take place. Just one application for me as a pastor, I like to preach on Sunday mornings in a suit, and just a dark suit, and I believe that that's just kind of the attention isn't on the clothes, it's on the message. And so let's make sure that in our life the attention is on the message that we're making, not whatever clothing that we might be wearing. Finally, we have the fourth topic about marriage and some of the violations that take place. God created marriage. He created marriage for one man and one woman. He designed intimacy to be shared in that covenant relationship, and yet we live in a fallen world. Marriages can be messy, and there's brokenness that take place. And so we're going to talk about marriage violations. And the first is from within marriage, when there is less than a wholesome covenant that's taking place. And so it says, if a man takes a wife and after sleeping with her dislikes her and slanders her and gives her a bad name, saying, I married this woman, but when I approached her, I did not find proof of her virginity. Now he's making a false accusation, okay? And he's trying to be able to get out of the marriage for cause that will uphold his reputation by running her reputation through the mud. She wasn't a virgin when I married her. It reminds me a little bit of the Christmas story of Mary and Joseph. And when Joseph finds out Mary's with child, his first reaction is, I'm going to divorce her quietly because she's pregnant and I'm not the father, and you make your own conclusions. Of course, God intervenes in a dream, and he goes along in a wonderful way. But that was his first reaction to take place. But here's this guy, scandalous kind of fella, who's willing to dismiss her with false accusations. There are some verses that show about the family comes through and proves the virginity that she experienced when they did get married, and the marriage that should be that should be honored take place. We shared a couple of weeks ago that when someone gives false testimony, tried to bring some kind of scandal down on somebody, the punishment was for that person who brought the false testimony to get the punishment that you were trying to bring the scandal on the other person. So there is punishment here when that takes place, when the proof of virginity is shown. The elder shall take the man and punish him. He's trying to come out clean and make her look bad, but they're going to punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the woman's father, young woman's father, because this man has given the Israelite virgin a bad name. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives. And those last phrases just astounding. You got to continue to be married to this scandal, this gentleman. He's not a gentleman, is he? You're going to be married to this scallywag? And just a couple of thoughts that understand this. One is she stays married to him because the reputation of a divorced woman was very harsh in biblical days. And so even though they may not live together as a couple, I doubt they would, that the marriage was still intact would help her in society more so than the scandal of being divorced. And also, as long as she was married to him, he was responsible for her. And so provisions and such were there. So the law was condemning the husband, but protecting the wife. And it's a bit odd in our culture to think of that taking place. But if you can see it in that light, in that light, I hope that you can see there's some mercy and grace that would be there. And then marriage violations outside of marriage in the form of adultery. If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge evil from Israel. There's one of those 9 times that phrase shows up. Reminds me, again, in the New Testament, John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery and brought before Jesus. And here's the accusation. Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say? Putting them on the spot, trying to get them to say something that they can use against him. And there's so much problems that take place here. You know, it says she was caught in the act of adultery. It says in Deuteronomy that death would be the punishment for both the man and the woman, but where's the man? Some hypocrisy here that's taking place. There's not equal application of the law that is going on. And of course, Jesus says, trumping justice is mercy in his saying, let the one without sin cast the first stone. And I'm sure for that lady, one of the sweetest sounds she ever heard in her life was the sound of rocks hitting the ground, because those folks dropping those stones that they had taken up ready to stone her. And, you know, Jesus turns to this woman and says, where are your accusers? Is there no one to condemn you? And he says, no one, sir. And said, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Not condoning the wrong, but certainly showing the mercy and the grace. And so, again, this is a story we see in the New Testament light of things. We will find also in these verses, and didn't include them sometimes, when there is rape, and in each one, the rapist was condemned. No crime was held against, and no condemnation toward the victim. Compassion would be shared toward the victim. Well, these are our 4 topics, and I think it's good to look at the book of Deuteronomy more from the principles that it shares for us to implement as best we can in our life. And so here's a few things I would bring back just to kind of summarize what's going on. First, there is to be respect for authority, because the rebellious son, he's not respecting his parents, which means he's probably not going to respect community leaders, people in leadership, ultimately not be respectful of God. And God designed us in a way with these systems that there are chains of authority that we need to recognize and we need to be respectful about. Second, there needs to be respect for neighbors. And so if something that belongs to your neighbor finds its way onto your property, you understand that. You show compassion and care. You go the extra mile for them, and the day will come when they'll need to go the extra mile for you. And it's not all about just me and mine, and as long as I'm taken care of and whatever is beneficial to me. Third is, there is a distinction between God's people and others. And we've had this so many times. We've talked weeks about holiness, and holiness means different, and saying to God's people, you're going to be different. Your diet is going to be different. Your economy is going to be different. Your system of government is going to be different. The way that you worship is going to be different. And here in this passage, your clothing is going to be different. So there should always be this distinction that we see. Jesus said, they'll know you're Christians by your love. You know you're my followers by your love for one another. And so those are these distinctions that should rise us up so that we are seen, and that needs to be understood. And finally, there is to be respect for marriage, and so that there are the two that become one, and hopefully in a covenant relationship where there's is not the friction and the false accusation, and there's not the adultery, of course, that would take place. And it's a beautiful thing that God created and that He designed, and that there would be respect for those things. Well, we have a few more lessons in Deuteronomy as we move along, again transitioning now into some different topics, and then some of the closure of Moses' story in this journey with his people. So I thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to next week and sharing together. You have a blessed day. God bless.